And good afternoon to the colleagues around this.
I wonder if Tahir Sitoto is hearing me. Hello?
I just have to unmute him 1 second.
Can you hear me?
Assalamualaikum. Yes, we can hear you now, Tahir.
And good afternoon to the colleagues around this conversation. Perhaps I should begin with some kind of a disclaimer, and that is to say I feel I was a bit ambushed to join a conversation that is already ongoing. I got to know about this about 2 days ago, and I had to break a self-imposed moratorium not to engage in public discourses of any kind, but the invitation has pressed me to lift that self-imposed moratorium. And that was prompted by reading the charter, the MUSA charter, as well as its aims, mission statement, and the vision that it seeks to realize. And reading that charter and the vision and the mission statement of this entity called MUSA sort of softened my stance. And I grudgingly agreed to join this conversation this afternoon. And I thought that I will preface my remarks with that, but also to say that mine is not really a neatly prepared presentation, as it were, but an attempt to speak around the brief that was given to me, emerging Muslims and what it may mean for an organization like MUSA, which is focusing on issues of socioeconomic justice. The panelists before me, Angela Fick and Amina Fakude, I believe have done a sterling work trying to problematize the idea and notion of social cohesion. So I will not waste time by trying to make sense of my own take and understanding of what social cohesion entails. Both Angelo as well as Amina have done a sterling job as far as that part is concerned. Perhaps one should begin by questioning the idea of what is meant by new emerging Muslims. In the disciplines in which we work in, we are trained not to take for granted at face value the concepts, the terminologies, the words, the language that we use. We are trained to problematize the very language that we use because of the imperative to question the familiar categories so that we can arrive at a better self-understanding of ourselves. I find the notion of new emerging Muslims highly problematic because it suggests that within the universal Ummah, whether it is in South Africa or elsewhere, there is that group, there is that entity that is perpetually framed as otherness. It doesn't matter whether they have been Muslims for over 4 decades, 5 decades, they're forever framed as otherness. So I would like to unpack this idea, notion of emerging Muslims. What does it mean? What do the organizers of this panel have in mind when they speak of new emerging Muslims? Are they shy of saying African, indigenous, Black Muslims? Is New Emerging Muslims a code? Is New Emerging Muslims a code for Black African Muslims? And so I would rightly rephrase and speak of Black African Muslims in the context of an initiative such as the ideals and vision articulated by MUSA. And when one does that, we then immediately began to tackle head on the elephant in the house, and that is the question of race, the question of race. That is to say, race still matters. Angela has done a sterling job trying to say to us, to remind us that racial inequalities still exist even in the moment after the fall of legislated apartheid, what others call the post-apartheid moment. We still have glaring racial inequalities. But let's not talk at the macro level and speak at the micro level, internal level of faith communities themselves. And here we address ourselves to the Muslim community itself. Muslims tend to pride themselves as a raceless, race-free community, a community that is not trapped by the problem of race. In the ideal world, perhaps yes, but in the living realities of Black African Muslims, indigenous to South Africa, race still matters. Big Muslim community cannot be social cohesion if this issue is sugar-coated. And here we are zooming into the Muslim community as a specific case study that reflects the broader problem and challenges facing South African society in general. We're using the Muslim community not to talk in exclusive religious terms, but to say, if we look at the Muslim community in South Africa as a case in point, as a case study, it is a reflection of problems confronting South African society in general. And therefore, if MUSA, this entity, rather than charting a broad, grand vision, like government's vision NDP, I think we need to speak in concrete terms. How can we make meaningful intervention by ensuring that, yes, to borrow the language of Angelo Fick, there is in solidarity, active solidarity. not active solidarity that only manifests itself at moments of crisis, active on at all times. And if Muslims cannot concretely demonstrate in a meaningful way through tested case studies, then we are unfortunately just like politicians, political formations, political parties who have these grand visions, grand plans that are up in the sky that do not mean anything for the person at the bottom of society. And for me, I think the challenge that I would like to put forward to an entity such as MUSA is it must at least begin, so to speak, start at home. Start at home. And level the racial inequalities that manifest themselves within the Muslim community in South Africa itself. Of course, speaking like this, one might say, well, is this not victimhood mentality? Not at all. I believe that the ideals, vision of MUSA can at least begin to be tested at a concrete level, and I'm presenting as a challenge that your case study is at a macro level, at the level of intra-Muslim social relations, social solidarity. If you cannot succeed at that level, how do you plan to convert and change the whole of South Africa? I'm trying to refrain from speaking about the broader macro social national challenges that face us as a nation. I think that faith communities are better placed to play a much more meaningful role in ensuring that, not as a political slogan, but in a to meaningfully declare war on hunger and poverty. If you live in the townships, if you had an occasion to partake in these moments of dishing out food parcels, one is disheartened. One is disheartened with the gross levels of inequality and poverty within our societies. And you ask a question, hamper food parcel brigades. It's a once-off thing, but what happens to the rest of the year of those who dish out these food parcels, so to speak? I'm using the example of the Muslim community and say perhaps there's an imperative. If we are going to talk about socio-economic justice, then we cannot divorce that conversation from the problem of race and racial inequality and the economic dispossession of the majority of Black people who unfortunately happen to be Africans and African Muslims, or what we refer to as the new emerging Muslim, unfortunately, is part and parcel of that vast majority of our population, the Black African population, that is at the lower echelons of the economic strata within our society. To be provocative, if you talk about socio-economic justice, how different are you as MUSA from, no pun intended, from the EFF? The EFF at least says they cannot do these things if they do not aspire and get hold of state power. At least they are clear. There's no ambivalence in their stance, whether one agrees or disagrees, whether one agrees or disagrees with their tactics and strategies. That's a different conversation altogether. But at least what anchors their party is around the question of economic justice, that they're saying not in the year 2050, 2060, but economic justice and freedom in our time. That language is very clear, very concrete. Whether one agrees or disagrees with them, that's a different conversation altogether. MUSA, if amongst its other ideals is to ensure that we have a society in which, as Julius Mwalimu Nyerere would say, every citizen does not sleep with a hungry stomach. How do we ensure that? At least at the macro intra-faith community level, before we even talk about interfaith solidarity, collaborations, which are necessary, but we need to at least begin at the level where we can say, within the limits, within the boundaries, within the confines of what we are as this faith entity, this is what we are suggesting we can do to level the gross inequalities that settle our society. How do you reconcile with the fact that you have a 5-star masjid with a heating system inside, air conditioned, within the same city, and yet across the railway line, you have a faith that shares the same faith, you have a community that shares the same faith, having a shack Jandolo as its masjid. So my suggestion, my proposal is, before we talk about the macro greater ideas of transforming South Africa and have social cohesion, we must, at the macro, practical, communal level, within the boundaries and limits of our faith communities, demonstrate that this can be done, this can be achieved. And then we can begin the task of cross-referencing, cross-sharing with others in working towards a greater ideal. I'm not shooting out the idea to dream in macro terms, but what I'm saying, as South Africans, by now, we are very skeptical of grand plans, well-meaning, well-intended, but they normally end up collecting dust or end up being discussed and shared in workshops and talk shops. And I'm not saying that we're doing that. Of course, we must begin by talking. And so, pardon me if I may appear to perhaps be lukewarm towards the ideal and vision of MUSA, but on the contrary, I'm putting a challenge to this initiative to say it must not be like the other initiatives that have come before. It must translate itself into a meaningful vehicle to make meaningful contribution that can be tangible, and touch communities in a very meaningful way, beyond just talking and dreaming about the ideal of a better South Africa. We know that those that are at the political helm have failed us dismally. And hence these various initiatives. MUSA is one of them. There are many others, because those that have the political power and authority to bring about meaningful change have failed to do so. And therefore, there's nothing wrong with dreaming, chatting, alternative plans, strategies, movements that can balance the status quo, so to speak. However, time is not on our side. The masses out there are in abject poverty. Even the so-called middle-class sector, it can be characterized as those that are suffering or in poverty and dignity. And so how does MUSA make meaningful change? At least as a starting point, by leveling the playing field within those that share the same ideas, same belief, to say it can be done here. And if the model can be done here, therefore it can be translated and transferred across the religious divide, so to speak. And this reminds me, and I'm going to conclude with this note for now, with our famed poet, Umaruddin Don Matera. He reminds us about what it means to do good. I think what Angelo Fig refers to as active solidarity. He says, I do good not because I want to go to heaven, I do good because it is the right thing to do. Don Matera again reminds us that the best religion, the best form of religion is the religion of compassion. Is the religion of compassion. But compassion cannot be talked about as an abstract idea, as an abstract concept. It must be embodied within the lived realities of our communities. Let me conclude with Mwalimu late Julius Nyerere. Of course, he was not a Muslim, but when Ramadan comes in, he would say, I'm so happy that Ramadan has started, because I know that in Tanzania, as a president, I will sleep sleepless night. Rather, I will sleep comfortably with the knowledge that every Tanzanian at least is not sleeping with an empty, hungry stomach because of Muslim generosity. But unfortunately, as soon as Ramadan is over, this generosity, to borrow from Angelo Fick again, this active solidarity, paraphrased as ongoing generosity towards the less fortunate, the other, stops with Eid, and it's business as usual. It's business as usual. And so can we turn the acts of generosity, active interhuman solidarity that is expressed in Ramadan, to say it cannot be business as usual. We have, how can we accept the challenge of the current moment, COVID-19 moment, to say things can be done differently. Things can be done differently. And that change is possible. Change is possible. South Africans are good, of good conscience, are doing their part. But that's not enough. That's not enough. That's not enough. We have to challenge those that have the political authority, to have political willingness to move beyond the current moment and put in the same measures that are putting in to address and say war on poverty, war on poverty. And so the Black Muslim is not a charity case for him or her to make meaningful contribution to the vision and ideal of a social economic justice. He must also speak truth. He must truth to power. He must speak truth to power. He must speak truth to power. And I believe in so doing, he or her will be advancing the ideas and vision of this initiative. Let me pause with those incoherent thoughts and comments, so that we don't have a monologue, but we have a meaningful dialogue and conversation. Thank you, Chair.
May I thank you, Dr. Tahir Sitoto, for this profound discourse you've given us. You really have given us a lot to think about. You really started off by dealing with the issue of identity, who are the Muslims that we also have used in this particular instance of talking about, and that your proposal is rather we know we should us. He then dealt with the issue of race, that race in this country matters, that race is real across the entire country, amongst Muslims in particular. And that, and then further on mentioned that South African Muslims are really by themselves a micro or the macro people of the country, or in the situation in the country, is what we do amongst ourselves as Muslims is the reflection of what is existent out in the country. You then asked us to have a clear vision and speak in concrete terms as to what is it that we want to do in a meaningful way. You then challenged MUSA to start at home, to start amongst ourselves. We said that there are racial inequalities amongst Muslims, and that for us, for MUSA, to make a claim that it wants to make a difference in society, that it must demonstrate amongst itself and within itself the capacity to change the conditions of indigenous African Muslims in particular, or the poor Muslims generally, because poverty amongst Muslims is not very limited to African Muslims as is generally accepted or believed. And that the issue and really what came out clearly was that the issue of race and economic disparity is paramount, and that when MUSA talks of social economic justice, it must have that in mind. And I want to thank you very much, Dr. Tahir, for that, for those excellent words. Clearly, your role as a University of KwaZulu-Natal must be greatly appreciated, and people around you must be really appreciating your input with your vast experience in Islam and and academia. We thank you very much. According to the agenda, I should be asking questions, and a question at least. The panel, our panelists have really gone very deep, and I think I may not have a question, but I would like to open to our committee members and say if there's anyone within MUSA who has a question, who may have written out a question.